Recently on the internet, there's been a lot of discussion around genital preferences and transphobia. In this video, I'm going to use the word cissexism instead of transphobia, but they're really similar words. At its most basic, cissexism means prejudice or discrimination against transgender people. So what's been happening is that some people are making the argument that it's not cissexist at all to only be attracted to people with one kind of genitals. For example, these people might argue that being attracted to only women with vaginas in no way negatively affects trans people. On the other hand, I would argue that it's more complicated than that. We all have our implicit biases built into our preferences, and gender isn't as simple as just the genitals you have. But after I say that, I usually get a bunch of blatantly cis-sexist responses, so I thought I'd address all of those responses at once. Number one, you're being homophobic. In this argument, I often get accused of homophobia, lesbophobia, or lesbian erasure by lesbians who believe that I'm trying to change their sexual orientation or identity. They say that my language sounds a lot like a dude who tried to turn them straight, or like conversion therapy. Those responses are rooted in cis-sexism. This is because I'm not telling lesbians that they can't be lesbians. If you're a woman who only likes women, go ahead, identify as a lesbian. But some women have penises, and if the fact that some lesbians might be attracted to those women offends you, it's because you don't think trans women are real women. That's because these accusations of homophobia make it sound like I'm trying to convince lesbians to like men, but I'm not. I'm trying to show that preferences for women with vaginas over women with penises might be partially informed by the influence of a cis-sexist society. You do not have to like men. You do not have to date men or have sex with men. And if you think that's what I'm arguing, you're simultaneously strawmanning my argument and implying that trans women are men. Number two, you're upholding rape culture. This is honestly the worst response that I've heard and probably the most cis-sexist one. That's because trans women have a long history of being accused of being rapists by cis women. It's the logic behind bathroom bills that prevent trans women from using the right bathroom. It's why some cis women are terrified of the idea of sharing a locker room with a trans woman. This is a very common tactic used by anti-trans folks to discredit trans women as just men trying to invade women's spaces so they can rape them. Even if this is not your intention when bringing this up, this is what you are implying, and it is where this argument comes from. Suggesting that trans women are rapists for wanting to be fully recognized as women is extremely harmful. And I should note that I'm not saying you have to do anything without consent. I'm a big fan of affirmative consent, and you should never feel pressured to have sex with somebody. This isn't about an individual. This is not saying you have to have sex with a trans woman or you're cis-sexist. It's saying that you should examine the societal influences on your preferences. There's a massive difference between honing in on individual scenarios and considering wider societal issues and attitudes. Number three, I'm allowed to have my preferences. Technically, you're right. You're allowed to have your preferences and you don't have to change anything. But there's more to it than that, and ignoring the deeper issues by stopping at a surface level analysis doesn't do this issue any justice. Like, you're allowed to have a lot of things. You're allowed to have prejudice towards trans people, but that doesn't mean you should. So if we look a little deeper into this issue, there's the possibility of your genital preferences being at least somewhat partially informed by growing up in a cis-sexist society. There's also the fact that a preference is different than saying you would never do something. Like, having a preference for tall girls is fine, but refusing to date anyone under 5'7" is ridiculous. And obviously that's not a perfect analogy because short girls as a group don't face the societal marginalization that trans women do. But I'm interested in having a conversation about labels and implicit bias and trans-inclusive language. Simply saying, it's my preference, end of discussion, is a good way of sidelining all of those issues and instead centering the feelings of cis people in a discussion that's about trans people. Number four, I have a trans friend who says this is okay. People love their tokens. I've done an entire video on moral licensing and why this is a terrible defense, but in summary, you'll always be able to find trans people to back up your cis-sexist views. You'll always be able to find gay people who spout anti-gay rhetoric. You can even find people of color who openly advocate racist policies. That doesn't make you right. Having a trans friend doesn't mean you're suddenly an expert on trans issues. People often internalize negative ideas about their own identities and regurgitate them with passion. I've met gay men who told me that their homosexuality was a sin and that their punishment was to be celibate for their entire lives. And even still, they'd probably go to hell. Obviously, that would be anti-gay for any straight person to say, and it's also not okay for gay people to advocate that. In the same way, if trans people are saying cis-sexist garbage, it's still cis-sexist garbage. And look, there are cis people who are on my side as well, so if you think it's okay to point to your token trans friend, then I can just point to my token cis friend.